Frank was buried here. He was 97 years old. He was a prisoner of war during World War II, and he's also served in Korea, and he was at the Battle of Chosin. Frank is like the embodiment of what I would consider the greatest generation. Coming up, serving in World War II, and then re-upping again to go into Korea. He embraced life.
Frank Maselskis was born in the early 1900s in Brooklyn, New York, in the heart of a very large Lithuanian-American community. Frank had a troubled young life. His father left early. He didn't get along with his mother. And so when he became a teenager, an uncle of his in Pasadena, California, offered to give him a home. So Frank came over to Pasadena, but he had a bit of trouble there as well. So instead, he decided he would try to enlist in the Marine Corps. He was too young, of course, to enlist, so he lied about his age. He served in many of the key Marine stations of the day. Maselskis did all of that and then returned to the Philippines, where he was posted when the U.S. entered the Second World War. You can imagine for Frank that he had been on peacetime duty in the Philippine Islands, and then attack was imminent. Very soon after, his unit came under attack by Japanese planes. And then the Japanese invasion began. And so the American troops didn't have air cover. They didn't have sufficient supplies. Conditions were terrible, and they had to retreat pretty rapidly. The Japanese who came in were well supplied. They had air cover, they had heavy artillery. And the Americans were pushed back. And after a time when it became clear that there was going to be no resupply, they had to surrender. Some of them, including Frank, were then put on ships. These were small Japanese freighters we call the hell ships. We call them the hell ships because people died at such a high rate in them. Prisoners of war, like Frank, were then taken to a spot where they were made to labor, often with not enough food, usually for Japanese corporations. For Frank, it was the Mitsui Corporation at the time, as a miner. It's amazing that he survived these terrible conditions. 40% of American prisoners of war didn't.
The Japanese were notoriously brutal towards their prisoners. There was a lot of torture. I don't think it's ever good to be a prisoner of war, but I think during the Second World War, it was very bad to be a Japanese prisoner of war because of this disdain for captured soldiers and for prisoners in general.
At the end of the Second World War, there wasn't a lot of knowledge or sophistication around trauma and recovery from trauma. But we now know that many Second World War veterans, in fact, experienced a sort of post-traumatic stress disorder. And this was particularly true for prisoners of war who had gone through these terrible experiences. We don't know precisely how these experiences affected Frank. He was well known in part about being pretty stoic and not talking about these things a lot. From not only being in combat, but being brutally treated as a laborer, and for, living through and somehow surviving these work camps. The amazing thing is that Frank not only survived these experiences, but he came out and he ended up rejoining the Marines, and this could only have happened because he was extremely resilient.
The war ended in late 1949 when the communists declared the establishment of the People's Republic of China under Mao Zedong's leadership. And so it was in that context that Truman and his advisors felt like they needed to take a very clear and strong stand in the face of North Korean aggression 6 months later.
Frank rejoined the Marines and went in with the first units, and then went with them when they were carried around to the other side of Korea to move forward towards the Chinese border, and participated in the Battle of Chosin.
The Chosin battle was one of the toughest battles for American forces involved in the Korean War. The fighting occurred in the early winter of 1950. People were suffering from hypothermia and frostbite because of the sub-zero temperatures.
You're walking up into these mountains. It's cold, it's dark. You don't really necessarily know when your next meal is coming from. You're moving into what you think might be a dangerous zone, and you get to camp and you're told to set up here in the mountains, that this is going to be your post for some time. And then suddenly you're under attack.
They also were facing not only North Korean soldiers, but also Chinese soldiers who had just entered the war.
The Chinese had come in. They really only had small arms, but a large number of them. Mortars, machine guns. This was the surprise, is that nobody expected the Chinese army to intervene. Nobody knew that it was nearby. There's the terror and the adrenaline and the hot fighting. You can't go to sleep because a lot of the attacks are taking place at night. You're freezing cold during the day even. You can't move. There's no motion to sort of move around. You're stuck in your post. All of this was, of course, really dramatic. And that in itself, of course, was a terrible endeavor.
The kind of defeat of that battle was really significant, to the psyche of American troops, but also in terms of strategy going forward in the war.
We don't know precisely how this campaign affected Frank, who, as we've already seen, was an incredibly resilient person. We can expect that he would have had some pride at surviving it and their achievements. It probably also haunted him. There were a high number of casualties, and it was a pretty terrible experience to go through.
Frank was a very interesting person. He never really cried or wept over his time as being a POW. He embraced that, and when he came back out of the service and became a civilian, he really embraced that. He was always happy. He just was a pillar of the community. Everybody that interacted with him left with a smile on their face. You would never know that he was that way.
Honestly, I have no idea why someone, after being held in captivity as a prisoner of war in one war, would voluntarily go fight in another war. I can only imagine that he was motivated by a really profound sense of duty. He kind of believed in the basic mission or goal of U.S. involvement in Korea, which was contributing to stability and potentially contributing to peace in that part of the world.
I guess I use this word resilient a lot to describe Frank. But part of the reason for that is not only his service in several wars, surviving as a prisoner of war, it's also because after all of this suffering, he somehow managed to create for himself a successful life in civilian society. He liked to play tennis. He liked to go to the clubs. He had 3 children. He's well remembered. An amazing life as a civilian after an incredible career as a Marine.